Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Dan Glickman. Dan is a nine-term congressman from the state of Kansas. He was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and a lobbyist for Hollywood. And today, we will speak about his latest book, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and on the Movies. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Alain.
So I'm just delighted to hear your life story. You are the son of immigrants. And well, let's start with there. Can you tell us about your childhood and how is it that someone in what I consider part of my narrowness, but I consider it to be Kansas in the middle of nowhere, how you from an immigrant family became a congressman?
Well, so my grandparents all immigrated from Eastern Europe and Central Europe back around 1900. And they had, the way a lot of people immigrated, they came to this country to find a better way of life and to escape persecution. And they were all Jewish immigrants, and they ended up in Cleveland and in Boston, but ultimately they had a couple of cousins. Both sets of grandparents had some cousins in Kansas City, and then from there, my grandfather on my father's side started in the scrap iron business and the recycling and metals business, and it was not very sophisticated in those days. And they ended up in Wichita, which is a town very much like Winnipeg, directly south of Manitoba, Winnipeg agriculture area. And my grandfather went into the pipe supply and scrap iron business and became, reasonably successful, and the rest is history. Grew up, I'm a third generation.
So at that time in history, how open was the United States immigration towards Jewish immigrants?
Well, back around 1900 or 1910, it was more open than it is today, certainly. And there were waves of people. It was not so much Jewish immigrants. It was more European, Central European, Eastern European. And so, there must have been 1 million or 1.5 million Jewish immigrants came to this country that way, certainly in the 30 years between the late 1890s and 1920 or so.
So your life story is one more example of what is called the American dream. A person who from modest background can aspire to have a high position either in government or in a private sector. Can you tell me if that dream's still alive, or is it becoming more and more difficult to achieve?
The dream's still alive, but it's not, it's more difficult. Plus, back in the early days, you had to fend for yourself. It took a lot of innovation, creativity, imagination. The government wasn't a massive help in terms of facilitating programs. We didn't have welfare programs like we do today. Whatever welfare there was generally by charitable organizations or churches. And so it took a pretty hardy breed of people to be able to make it in a world where there was not that kind of support system from government. And so so my family was, and they also, one other thing, there's a gene of humor that goes through my family. Humor got my grandparents through life. My grandfather was once said that he was one of the first settlers in Kansas. He settled for 10 cents on the dollar. And so and my father was very funny and would have been a comedian had it not been because of the Depression in the 1930s. So humor had a lot to do with the success in my family.
Well, now it seems like America is becoming more divided in between the have and have-nots, and one of those impediments is education. How crucial do you think is education for someone who is a have-not to become one of those who have?
It's like a glass half full, half empty, I would say. We have the greatest university system in the world in America, and there's a lot of opportunities for scholarships. for less affluent people, but it's still hard to navigate that trail if you're, let's say, an immigrant family from south of the border and coming in, and you live in an environment that's is poor, and so some people can make it through that system, but it's tough, it's difficult, and in some sense, it just takes a lot of luck. But more than anything else, it takes this kind of this natural perseverance, this natural drive. Some people have it, some people don't have it. And it's encouraged by mentors like, faith-based leaders. Sometimes great school teachers can do this. But it also can result in bad outcomes as well. Sometimes there's no way to really predict who succeeds or fails in this kind of society.
Right. I'm beginning to see that nowadays corporations and governments are not requiring students to have a four-year degree, for example. And there are so many classes available online, many of them for free as well. Yet education seems to be a huge barrier for people. And I don't know if it's the access to education, or if it's a psychological barrier that says, if I don't go to one of the top schools, I'm not educated.
Well, I think that's a very good point, but we have a blooming community college system in America. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of community colleges where people can enter the education system without having to go to a famous four-year college. And there are also an awful lot of jobs, well-paying jobs, that do not require a four-year college education or a graduate degree. I think what we're finding is that there's a lot of potential success, entrepreneurial success, for people who don't even go down the long-term educational route. I mean, it does help, let's be honest with you. If you have a Harvard education, or I went to the University of Michigan, very fine school, it helps you with getting to law school or medical school or those kinds of things, but I'm not sure it's absolutely required anymore.
Okay, and I wonder if you have any comments on the division of race and education as well. As you know, white people tend to have better education than Black or immigrants, and I still, of course, there are so many systemic reasons for that, but I wonder what's your take.
Well, there's no question that racism has been part of the American culture for many, many years. Obviously, not all Americans are racists, but the system it's more of a class division, but it's also racial division. And but the recent events in the U.S., the George Floyd situation, all the discussion now about racial division is at least causing us to think about this from a sociological perspective. And I see the private sector is now becoming much, especially big companies, much more involved in philanthropy to the historically Black colleges and universities, where there are dozens of them focused on African American students. So, and the major universities are also giving some greater attention to this. So out of the bleak happening of what we've seen, I think maybe some good things are coming out of it.
Okay, so can you tell us then, how is it that you, from your hometown in Kansas, you made it all the way to Congress? What was the series of events that led you to Washington, D.C.?
Well, I had unconditionally supportive parents. That helps. Then I was lucky. And Mark Twain once said, "The older you are, the luckier you get." And there's this old thing. He says, when I turned 12, I couldn't believe how foolish my father was. When I turned 21, how much he had changed in 9 years. And so, I was lucky. And I went to good schools. And then I came back to Kansas thinking I'd go into business. And then I jumped at the opportunity to run for Congress when people told me not to, that I couldn't win, and I didn't know any better. I was 28 years old or 30 years old, and when you're younger, you'll take risks. That's the important thing, is being a risk taker, but an intelligent risk taker, not a stupid risk taker. So I took risks, ran for Congress, and then I got involved in agriculture, which I didn't know anything about. My father was in the scrap iron business, in the oil business, and not in agriculture, but it turned out to be a very positive, fortuitous thing, because I became an expert in agriculture, and that helped me all the way through my life and everything that I did.
So, in your time as congressman, can you just highlight one big moment, one moment of success that you had, and maybe one moment of great failure and defeat? And
Well, of course, I lost my last race for Congress in 1994, so that was a moment of great defeat. But uh, I don't know. I had lots of successes, small legislative successes, but my hometown of Wichita was the home of general aviation. Half the airplanes in the world were made in Wichita, Kansas. You may not know that. Beechcraft, Cessna, Learjet, which is part of Bombardier, which is a Canadian company now, the Boeing company. And I became an advocate for airplane manufacturers, and I passed major legislation that created thousands of jobs in that business. And so a lot of blue collar workers owed their jobs to my work in that field.
and then you became Secretary of Agriculture. What was your major role or some highlights of your career, some success and failure as well?
Well, I mean, you would think the agriculture department, all it deals with is farmers, and it was a big part of it. So most countries, their agriculture department tries to help farmers, but the jurisdiction of the agriculture department also had the U.S. Forest Service. The largest part of the Department of Agriculture was the Forest Service, had 40,000 employees. Now, I grew up in Kansas. We didn't have very many trees in Kansas, maybe 5 trees in the whole state. Well, a few more than that. But anyway, so the Forest Service, had to become an expert in forestry and timber and all the stuff that you deal with in Western Canada, we dealt with in the United States, except we had forests in all parts of the United States, the South as well as the West. We also were the department for feeding programs for the poor, the food stamp program, the school lunch program, the women, infants, children program, nutrition programs. So, and then food safety. So we had a lot of jurisdiction. I had 100,000 employees working for me. And so it was a big management job. And one of the things I had to learn is how you manage 100,000 people, especially when you know you're not going to have the job you'll have the job as long as the president who appointed you has the job. And so being a congressman where I maybe had 25 employees was a lot different than being a Secretary of Agriculture where I had 100,000 employees. And I dealt a lot with foreign governments and trade issues and those kinds of things.
Just because I don't know much about the subject, and I guess I have discussion with some of my friends. How big is the role of subsidies in agriculture, and how much of a double sword that is? I mean, there are some winners and losers. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you probably will always need subsidies. Every country has them. Canada has plenty of them, the US, Europe. And part of the reason is because agriculture is vulnerable because of weather and climate. And of course, we have climate change now, but I'm talking more about the fact that, a bad storm can wipe out a farm, and a trade restriction can wipe out the ability to grow certain crops. So you'll probably always have subsidies in agriculture. Even back in biblical times, Joseph was the agriculture minister to the Pharaoh, and they built subsidies so that they would create a grain reserve. In the event that things got bad, they had to raise enough to feed people. But the question is how big the subsidies are. Do they create bad incentives so that people will plant for the subsidy rather than plant for the marketplace? And there are a lot of issues about how the subsidies should be created and how big they should be. And the other thing is that subsidies have tended to help bigger farmers, because the bigger you are, the more subsidy you get. And so we've seen a lot of consolidation in agriculture worldwide over the last 50 years. Far fewer people. After all, we only have in America, about 1.5% of the people are actually farming. Well, around the year 1900, it was 50% of the people. And part of that is because people have gotten a lot more productive, and science and technology has made it so you can produce more with less. But I think the subsidies have also had something to do with it.
Okay. Well, you also mentioned in your book that part of your success or your good luck is your willingness to listen. But in politics, generally, people are not listening to each other; they are screaming at each other. I wonder, in politics and in general, how can we become better listeners and have more empathy for each other and try to understand each other instead of fighting against each other?
It's a very interesting question because in the business world, successful business leaders learn to listen. They have to, because if they don't listen, they won't know what their consumers or stakeholders want, and then their profits will disintegrate, and then they'll be out of the job. So I think the business world does a better job of listening than the political world does. But my mother used to say that you have two ears and one mouth for a simple reason. You're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk, and you might actually learn something from the other person, and maybe you might actually change your mind if you hear a different point of view or a different perspective. And I think the changing nature of our media has had something to do with failure to listen. We tend to listen to those things that we agree with. And and of course, now we have such an abundance of media that's out there, of different perspectives. So I don't have to turn something on if I disagree with them. I can go to another station where they might agree with me more. And that's not the only reason why, but I do think the art of listening is something that we have lost in politics, not just in the United States, but globally as well.
I find it curious that, for example, in the political arena, or uh, generally a person will agree with one issue and disagree with another issue, but because we are all trained to agree with all these issues and disagree with all the other ones, so I think maybe personality is being taken out of us and we are just being trained that if you like this, you must like this, and this other thing. So I find myself talking with friends and I just find it weird that they all of a sudden agree on those common issues that everybody else from this political arena agree with. They don't. So I think media is having a great effect on the way that we think. I think we are being brainwashed in a way.
Well, we don't value political independence. At least in the U.S., loyalty and adherence to political party has become very dominant. And so when I ran for Congress again in 1976, and during the early years I served in Congress, I felt that I was able to go along with my party when I thought it was right, but go along with the other party or be independent when I didn't think they were right. Now, it helped that my party had big majorities, so I was a lot more free to challenge, let's say, my political party. But I think we've become too attached to our political parties. It's almost like we have a tribal mentality. If you're a Democrat, you can really never disagree. And if you follow the politics in our country now, we have this one senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin is his name. And Senator Manchin is a Democrat, but he's an independent, and he doesn't always go along with his party. And he's getting a fair amount of criticism from some, but I actually kind of admire him for showing courage.
Right. Okay. So moving on, then you told us about agriculture. Now, how is it that you landed in the movie industry?
I was very lucky, I guess.
And good looking as well, eh?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I used to have hair your color, and mine now it's turned different color. But So after I left Congress and I went to actually Harvard University, where I ran a program educating young people for a couple of years, I got the opportunity. The man who ran the Motion Picture Association was named Jack Valenti, and he had had the job for many years, and he was retiring, and he liked me. And the job was basically being the chief lobbyist for Hollywood in Washington. I wasn't an actor, or I wasn't in movies itself, but I was, arguing for their interests before Congress and state legislatures. So, and there's a lot of parallels. The movie industry, entertainment is very much global. More than half of our product is sold overseas. Same way with agriculture. And of course, a lot of movies are made in Canada. because of the provinces have these great incentives, particularly British Columbia. That my son's in the movie business, and he's made several movies in British Columbia.
Nice.
But anyway, so it wasn't a natural phenomenon. I used to say that, well, when I was in agriculture, I used to know how to grow popcorn, and then when I was in the movies, I would sell popcorn. It got a little chuckle from
Right.
people, but but it was a change. I dealt with a whole different group of people. The movie business is in some sense, a much tougher business than the political world.
The title of your book is Laughing at Myself, and you make it a point to mention that humor is a big part of your life. Can you tell us how humor continue helping you along in your life?
Well, when I got into trouble, not serious trouble, but let's say political trouble, I would often I would sing a lot, and I'd write these songs, these kind of parody songs, funny songs, and most of the people in politics didn't think I had a very good voice, but I would sometimes do that to make fun of myself. And then when I was in the agriculture department, um, for whatever reason, I had a lot of people throwing things at me. They threw infected buffalo guts at me. They threw tofu cream pies at me. The naked protesters threw GMO seeds at me. At different stages, they were protesting, and so I learned how to make light of that and exploit it, and became very, very funny. And I learned a couple things. Number one is be careful the crowd that you go and speak to, because you never know what they're going to do to you. But but the other thing is that it was a good way to humanize my job. One lady, I remember I was at a big nutrition event, and a lady threw a tofu cream pie at me. Tofu, of course, is made from beans, and she yelled and called me a pimp for the meat industry. And she threw this pie at me, and I was with some other American politicians, Senator Dole and others, and I was moved very fast, and missed me, and it hit Senator Dole and another couple of politicians on the back, and it got big coverage all over the country, and it was because it was so funny, it was so ridiculous, and I used to find myself in those kind of situations. I'm not a natural comedian. I don't think politicians need to be like comedians, but I do think that they need to be recognize the power of humor in self-deprecating humor, not like Donald Trump humor. He didn't have the kind of humor I liked. He was a bully, but the kind of humor where you could make fun of yourself, and I thought it was a useful tool in leadership.
And how can we in our regular life add more humor to make things more bearable?
Well, I mean, part of it is just taking a deep breath periodically, and and not get agitated over every little thing that happens. And in politics, part of it is, as I say, valuing independence and valuing interpersonal qualities that you can show some self-deprecating humor and empathy. The problem today, to be honest with you, is when you say something kind of funny, it'll go on the internet and last till the end of time. And a lot of people worry that if they say something funny, it will be taken out of context, or it'll be
Mhm.
politically incorrect. And I don't mean humor that's bad or that makes fun of other groups. I'm talking about self-deprecating humor. I think the modern social media ironically, has probably made it so people are not as comfortable being as funny as they
Right.
could be.
And it so happens that what could be funny today may not be funny 5 years from now. And you
But
get yourself into trouble for something you said in the past, I guess.
But great political leaders of any country almost always, or impactful political leaders, almost always have a good sense of humor. Um, and, again, I don't mean to be overly partisan, but I don't think that Donald Trump is going to have much staying power, because I don't think he's funny at all. I think he's unfunny. Whereas, even I'm a Democrat, but I thought that even George W. Bush, who was somewhat controversial
Mm.
president, had a nice sense of humor and a nice quality to him, and Bill Clinton was that way. And you go back into history, and almost every great American political leader has had a good sense of humor.
Wow. Okay. Well, your life story is fascinating. It gave us hope that things could happen if you put your heart into it, and there is hope for the future. So, I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people find it.
So it's called Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. And it's available on Amazon, of course, like everything is. And then it's also available at the University of Kansas Press. So you can Google that as well. And it hopefully at some local bookstores too, but anyway, and as many people who can buy it is great because my grandson is starting college next year and I need the revenues.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.